Hello and welcome to my slideshow of my natural landscape photography. I've been doing this kind of photography of the landscape probably for about 20 years now, visiting loads of different countries, lots of different places. It's one of my big inspirations. I love photographing cities and creating kind of imagined views and things like that, but I think the natural landscape is really where my heart is at with photography. So I've decided to create a slideshow of my natural landscape images, and I've just put them into a really kind of haphazard order. And there's two different versions of that. There's one version that's got a woodland soundtrack of kind of birds and kind of quite a relaxing background, and that just kind of moves through the images slowly. But then I thought, while I was making that, I thought people might want to know where the locations were and perhaps a little bit about them. So I thought I'd do a second one, which is me discussing these places I've got to, a little bit about the photography, what I was trying to do in the images, and just try and give you a little bit sort of behind the scene information and let you know what I was trying to achieve with the photographs. So we're going to work our way through them. There's around about 100 images, so feel free to dip into whichever bits you like. But yeah, I hope this is really interesting. And here we go. So this first image we're looking at is from up on the Roaches in Staffordshire, which is right on the edge of the Peak District, and it's this gritstone ridge that's a couple of miles long, and there's some really beautiful landscape near there. There's these lovely rock formations that are quite sculptural. This one was from early 2020, and I was up there all day, but I was trying to wait for the sun to set, and I was trying to be in just the right place for the sunset. So I found this lovely gap where the sun sits in the middle, and you've almost got this kind of symmetry of stones. And it was just a really beautiful view, and just seeing that as the sun dropped, it started clipping these stones and giving them really lovely shape. This next image was also the Peak District. This was from close to Tissington, or at least the hot air balloon I was in took off from Tissington. So, but this is probably a couple of miles away because it was with a long lens, and we were up in a balloon, so we could see a long way. But it's the kind of white peak area of the Peak District, where it's kind of rolling countryside, not as rocky as the Dark Peak area. And I just loved. We were lucky enough to get up there on this really kind of misty morning. So you had the hills kind of just popping out of the mist, and then as it dropped down to the valleys, everything slowly disappeared again, and you just saw this kind of undulating landscape through the mist. This is a macro detail of buttercups from Cornwall at sunset. So it's shot with what's called a macro lens, which allows you to focus really, really closely. But I've got this way of working with a macro lens that also means I can shoot about 10 images, left and right of that, above and below, and then use Photoshop to bring them together and create this real close-up images, but they're also wide at the same time, which is great for things like this, where you really want to capture that sort of detail of the flowers and the textures of the petal, and then sort of play that off against the light of the sun in the distance on this beautiful evening in Cornwall. Now we're going into the Cathedral Caverns in the Lake District, close to the valley of Little Langdale, and this was, I think, well, one of the largest caverns in there. And that column, it's all man-made. It's a slate mine, I think a green slate mine, and the central column was left there to support the roof. So it was that kind of supports a lot above it, and it's very thick. It's probably about 2 meters thick, and then beyond that there is a big opening of the cave. So I positioned myself so I just obscured that opening, so you can almost see the light coming either side, but I'm just out of the reach of it. But that means you do just see the effect of that light. You don't see the light source, but you see the way it's falling and defining this amazing kind of sculptured stone landscape almost. And it felt like it. I've shared this a lot of times, and a lot of people say it looks like almost being beneath a stone tree. You've got the kind of trunk going up, and all the shapes, and then the kind of canopy of the tree above. Now we're moving on to a dandelion photograph. This was at sunrise on the same morning as the balloon flight, and it just had this beautiful light. I tried to have the circle of the sun in a very equivalent size to the circle of the dandelion, and then just offset it slightly, just to kind of contrast this thing that's a couple of like 2 or 3 centimeters across, this flower with the sun. These just two massive scales, but they sit within the same shot at almost the same size. Moving on to a shot from the same morning, and this is just moving back, going a little bit wider, and you can see the kind of undulating landscape here, the kind of humps and hills. I think that's signs of old farming that happened there. This is near Tissington in the Peak District. And I just love shooting at sunset, sunrise, where you get everything's being clipped by the sun. It's skimming across things and giving them really interesting definition and shape. Yeah, and these two I've shown quite close together, but I've tried to sort of jumble the images up, not have too many images from the same place. I thought for a while maybe I could do little stories or a country at a time, but then I thought images have a nice kind of energy when they're in a kind of relatively random order, but hopefully they kind of each image is a little bit different than the one before, so they're a bit mixed, but hopefully they still kind of draw you in and keep you interested. Now we're looking at a snowscape. This is near Arbor in the Peak District. I was out there. I was the first person out there. There was only animal footprints when I got out there, and the landscape was so white, and it was while the snow was still falling. So the trees, the sky, everything was really white. So it was lovely to get this kind of one bit of definition, the hillside wood as a centre, and then let everything else be almost pure white, just a little bit of texture, a little bit of details from the drifting snow. Now we're looking at Snowdonia. This was after a day spent walking up Snowdon and up some of the big slate mines near there. I was driving home and I looked in my rearview mirror and just saw this amazing clouds and shapes in the clouds. And you've got Snowdon there, kind of almost central to the image. Sometimes you photograph at sunset and then pack up and go home. You think that's it, it's all happened. But often it's in the hour and a half after sunset when you get a really interesting, dramatic light. And in this one, we've got, you might just be able to see it, there's just the light of a car. It was almost a totally natural view, except maybe a few fence posts. But I just like that little detail, that little human scale, the headlights of a car just sitting in the landscape. And now we're moving on to an image from early 2020. This is I was walking up to Troller's Gill, which is this lovely little gully. And this was all the trees and the pathways heading up on a really frosty morning. And the sun was so low, it was this lovely low winter sun. It was clipping everything and it created this kind of gorgeous, inviting light and just kind of drew you down the path. It was just a really beautiful place to be. This is in the Mayhill Woodlands, which is in Gloucestershire. I've been there a lot. We've got some friends that own a bit of land there, so I go back quite often, and I'm quite obsessed with the woodland down there. I've got a picture later of some of the fungi, and this is just a drip of water with the woodland behind, but you can just about make out some of the woodland in that drip. And now we're up to a cloudscape almost. This is sometimes when you look out of a plane window, above the clouds almost looks like a landscape. You've almost got valleys and troughs and kind of little gullies. So this was a photograph from a plane window, but I took lots of images and put them together to almost look like a landscape, look like I was photographing in the hills, but it's the softness of clouds. But that was my idea, to kind of capture this image of a cloudscape as a landscape. This is in southern Iceland. I think it's the most southerly point of Iceland, this big rock bridge. And I was there in January 2015 when the days were incredibly short. So I got loads of images at dusk. There was a very long dusk, but the actual sunlight was quite short. And it was magnificent. The waves crashing in, the scale. It was so beautiful, the weather. It was just, Iceland is such a beautiful country, and I hope to get back there and photograph more. It's really inspiring. Every corner you take as you're driving around is just breathtaking. And this was for a project I was working on with Curated Place, so thanks to Curated Place for setting up access to this. And it was for a film I was making for the Spectra Light Festival in Aberdeen. This is another dandelion. There's a couple of dandelion pictures here. This was only a few weeks ago. I'm recording this and we're currently in lockdown in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I've been doing a lot of local photography. I've not been going too far from my house. And it's been a really good year for dandelions because a lot of the embankments near where we live have been allowed to overgrow because there's not been, I guess, not as much focus on trimming them back, which is fine because you get to see all these beautiful wildflowers. And there's been so many dandelions, and where I live is in the city and there's not the beauty of landscape I kind of see when I'm out in the hills. So I found myself drawn to these kind of macro details, these absolute close-ups. And there's something so sublime about a close-up detail of a dandelion. It's almost like a little universe in itself of this kind of fine, perfect detail. So I've been photographing those a lot over the last couple of months while the lockdown's been happening. This is out near Castleton, behind the Peveril Castle. There's some areas you can walk around, these kind of little valleys and rock formations up there. This was on a very misty morning. We've been staying in Castleton and walked up really early, and the mist was so thick. It was beautiful and atmospheric. And it just really showed these trees with lovely definition. I like you've got this one in the foreground that's very defined, and then in the background you've got these trees kind of drifting out. This is near Gunwala in Cornwall. on a cliff edge looking out towards Mount Bay. And you've got the sea thrift, those pink flowers that thrive on cliff edges all around the UK. And it's just looking down at some of the beautiful rock formations. And again, it's that idea of shooting at sunset when the light is so low, everything's just being clipped by the light. So everything's so beautifully defined. You've got that warm light hitting the rocks. And it was just a really beautiful evening to be out there and capturing the landscape. And this is one from Cornwall as well. It might have even been the same day, or it might have been the next day. It was close to that day at the same time as the last one. On certain days when the weather's right, the clouds are right, you get this halo right around the sun. And at certain points, kind of left and right of it, you get these really bright spectrums of light, similar to a rainbow, but instead of it being away from the sun, it's next to it. And you've got this lovely little tight spectrum of brightness, which is known as a sundog. And there were just these birds moving around in front of it. So with a long lens, I just got this kind of mix of these lovely vivid colours, and then the subtle sky, and then the birds kind of mixing up and moving around with it. And now we're back on the Roaches. This is looking towards Hen Cloud. That rock formation in the distance is called Hen Cloud, and I love the name of it. For something so solid and permanent, or seemingly permanent, Hen Cloud is such a kind of soft, dreamy name. And this is photographing from the end of the Roaches, so it's kind of framed by the rocks of the Roaches, but then you're looking at Hen Cloud and then the landscape beyond. Just coming towards sunset, so the light's getting low and everything's just catching those last rays of light. This was from a trip we were sailing between England and Norway, and I just noticed every few waves the sunlight created a little rainbow as the waves crashed up high enough. So you just had this lovely rainbow coming and going. So I stood there for a while. I managed to film it, but then I managed to photograph it as well, and slowly waiting for the waves to crash. And occasionally there'd be one that was big enough to create this kind of subtle, drifty rainbow effect, which was really only lasted about a second, but it was it just had this lovely light, and it was nice to sort of stick around and try and capture it. This is one of the first images I took that I would call like a panoramic landscape. I'd been working in a photography studio for probably about 5 or 6 years, and I'd been trying these ideas out, experimenting with building images in the studio. I've been learning Photoshop. I've been trying ideas out in my local park, and this was the first image when I could really put those ideas to use. So this is built out of about 50 or 60 images, as are a lot of the landscapes I've shown you already. A lot of them are composite landscapes, so built out of many photographs. And it just allows me to capture loads of detail and create a really capture that highlight around the sun, the low lights, just capture a big range of detail as well as sharp detail. And as I put them together, they could take on these kind of organic forms and shapes. And I like kind of working into it, and them almost looking like this kind of meeting point between a photograph and a painting. And this was the first time when I really sort of succeeded with that, when that really worked out. This is from Rabness in Essex, and that barn's gone now. It's I used to go back every year or so and see it in different weather, because it was like the starting point of this way of working. So this is one I wanted to put in. It's you're probably thinking it stands out quite a lot from the rest of the images, but it's kind of relevant to now. I wanted to put this in because it's relevant to the situation we're in, because we're kind of during lockdown in 2020, and this is what I could see of the city for the only way I could see Manchester for a while was looking through the trees, through a bit of nature close to our house, and then the distant lights of the city. So it kind of, I wanted to create almost like a landscape that showed how our world had reduced, how we'd suddenly gone from being in the city every day to just seeing it in the distance. Suddenly, our boundaries shrank, and this image kind of captured that and kind of used the local nature to frame it, the trees and the branches and the leaves. This was an amazing trip it was a flight from Reykjavik, again on that same trip in Iceland, and we flew out to see this volcano erupting. I think it erupted for a couple of months, and it stopped a couple of weeks after this. This was in 2015, and the light was beautiful. We headed off before sunrise and got there as the sun was low in the sky, and it was just the most stunning thing we'd seen. We'd been flying over the Icelandic landscape, just ice, blueness, coldness, whiteness, and suddenly in the distance we saw this smoke on the horizon, and suddenly we started smelling the sulfur. And then we got there and we did about 3 circuits, because we were in a little plane, so we had to be heading back whilst we had lots of fuel, so we couldn't spend that long there. But in those 3 circuits I just kept photographing, kept filming, and got this photograph. And I managed to get rid of the plane from it. I managed to get the plane to be at slightly different angles and get rid of the wing and the window. It's just a small little 4-seater Cessna. So I got rid of all the details of the plane and created what looks like almost like a drone shot of it, but actually it was just from the buzzing around in this little 4-seater. Here's one that probably again stands out as a little bit different, but I wanted to cram all nature in here, all different ideas of nature, not just landscapes, but details like the rainbows and the sundogs, all these phenomenons that I've managed to capture over the years. This is bioluminescence in a Florida lagoon, in Mosquito Lagoon near Titusville, near the Kennedy Space Station, Cape Canaveral. And on the last night there, I was part of an arts festival there. We went out on kayaks in the lagoon, and it was a really good year for the bioluminescence. And I just put my hand in the water, and you could see the light as you moved it, but I couldn't figure out how to photograph it. It's a really kind of fleeting effect. So I came up with this idea of having someone slowly tow me in their kayak, just really slowly, and then I held my hand perfectly still in my kayak, locked against the side of the boat, and I held the camera locked against the side of the kayak, still as possible. So everything was moving, and it was a 30-second exposure, but the only things that weren't moving were my hand and the camera. They were staying totally in position to each other. So it meant that all that time, the bioluminescence, billions of these bioluminescent organisms drifted over my hand, and because I was disturbing the water, they activated, or I don't know what the word would be, but they glowed, because they glow when they're disturbed. And all of those countless bioluminescent organisms, because my hand was in the same place, just defined it and lit it. And it was so faint, your eyes had to adjust for about an hour or two, you could see it. But by doing a 30-second exposure, it meant loads of that tiny amount of light could be soaked up over a long amount of time. So it meant you could see this definition and this kind of almost kind of electric hand, or it looks like it's in kind of some kind of blue flame or something like that, but it's all real. That's a totally genuine photograph, and it's just awe-inspiring what nature does. This is from one of my favourite locations that I've returned to many times. There's probably some more photographs of this later in the slideshow. It's a place called Odin's Gully, or it's near Odin's Mine, and I call it Odin's Gully, and I know a few other people that do as well. And it's near the Hope Valley at the bottom of Mam Tor. And this was the first time I went there and photographed it. And since then, I've been back probably about 20, 30 times and seen it all over the seasons, in snow, autumn. Been back with sound recorders, filmed it. But this was the first time I went there and just spent a few hours on my own documenting the rocks and the cliffs and the trees and the hillside woods and the view beyond, and it's just a really inspiring place, and I can't wait to get back. This is in the Brecon Beacons. We were staying in this little cottage. We stayed a few times, and we got snowed in. I couldn't move my van, so we spent about 3 or 4 days there, but we had a nice warm fire every night. But I just stepped out on this moonlit night and from the really warm cottage and got this photograph. Hopefully you see that sort of glow and warmth of the cottage, but then the coldness of the moon. And it's really interesting. Sometimes on a moonlit night, the moon can be really, really bright, but fields, trees, forests, things like that just soak up the moonlight. They just make it look quite black. But when snow suddenly lands on the ground, you realize how bright moonlight is, because suddenly it contours the land, it shapes it. It almost looks like daylight. It's so bright. If you get a snow-covered countryside on a full moon, it is so defined and bright because it's just bouncing back that moonlight in your eyes. So this was a really good chance to capture that in a photograph and really show the countryside and the shapes of it through the snow lit by the moonlight. This was sailing east, looking west on the Mediterranean at sunset, looking out the back of a ship, the waves sort of churning behind, the sunset sitting directly above where we were coming from. This is another one from the edge of a glacier in Iceland. I'm sorry I'm not pronouncing the Icelandic names. My memory for place names is awful, and I'm embarrassed by it. I'll put some notes in the comments below for the ones I've not been able to pronounce the names, just so you know where they are. But yeah, this is close to the edge of a glacier, and this almost alien-looking landscape. It looked so strange and so kind of inhospitable. We went in these huge jeeps with wheels almost as tall as me to get out there, that could actually drive across the glaciers, but you couldn't get out there in a normal 4x4 would have probably struggled. But yeah, it's just amazing to see it, and it was so cold. I think I was out there for about 2 or 3 minutes, and I had fairly cheap waterproof trousers on, plasticky ones, and suddenly I noticed there was a crunching noise, and I realised the plastic in the trousers had frozen, and I was kind of crunching along because it was so cold. My clothes were kind of freezing out in about 2 or 3 minutes. but it was so beautiful as well. It was like another world. It was like something out of his Dark Materials, like a Philip Pullman book. This is on the same trip as the sailing east one I just shown. This is, I think, even on the same day. This was a moonlight over the Mediterranean, catching the reflecting in the waters on almost a full moon. Well, it's kind of quite a full moon, and it was just absolutely beautiful. And I used a thing to clamp my camera so it held steady, and I could do fairly long exposure of the water and the sky. This is in the Fens in Cambridgeshire, or the Cambridgeshire part of the Fens in East Anglia, and it's actually near a town called Wisbech, which is where I was born and where I grew up. And probably about 10 years ago now, I went back with my dad and we camped in this orchard, and this was very close to where we were camping. I got the camera very low. I'm really interested in putting the camera in sort of low positions, right down in the grass, very high up in water, trying to put your camera in strange, interesting places. So this was down in the grass on this orchard, yeah, it was just a really nice memory, and it took me back to my childhood growing up in that part of the world. A close up of a wave from, I think, Formby Beach or Ainsdale Beach, and yeah, it's just a momentary detail. Another one of those images of a fleeting moment. Everything would have changed a second later. Another fleeting moment here: a cloud drifting over some of the hills near a fjord in Norway would have just moved on a few seconds later, but I just liked the way it was just on its own, kind of this one cloud floating on its own above the hills. And this photograph is of the River Noe, which is spelled Noe. I've never heard anyone pronounce it. I've only ever seen it written on maps, but it's basically the river that runs down the Vale of Edale. From Edale, this is a bit further down the valley, and I was stood in it in a pair of wellies quite early in the morning, kind of half hungover. I'd been camping, and it was my birthday the night before, and it was just a really beautiful kind of dreamy morning, and the light was really kind of drifty and had this really nice kind of pearl-like quality to it. So I really want to capture that in this photograph, this kind of drifting of light and this kind of vague fuzzy morning in the landscape. This is another one of those really kind of chance fleeting moments. This is a solar eclipse from Manchester, from my back garden, and I just pointed my camera at it to see what would happen. And it was quite a cloudy day, so I wasn't holding out much hope. And then just as I took it, I noticed something flick past the camera as well. And I quickly had a look on the back of the camera, and I saw this magpie. I just managed to catch this magpie just flying past just as the clouds cleared. And I got this really unusual shot of a magpie just shooting past the sun and the moon, these things converging in this one image. It was just a really nice little chance moment, unplanned, but created quite an interesting kind of gothic looking photograph. This is back up on the top of the Roaches. We've done a few from up there. This is on Doxley Pool, and it's this up on the moorland where you've got this kind of pool of water, quite muddy water, but if you get the camera low enough, it just can create the most wonderful reflections of the rock formations. And the rock formations on their own look really sculptural and really kind of deliberate in places, but then reflecting it looks even more deliberate and controlled and kind of sculptural and kind of considered. So by getting low, I could really kind of emphasize that through this quite clear reflection that was going on. This is Slater's Bridge in Little Langdale, close to where Cathedral Caverns is, which I showed in an earlier photograph. Just this old bridge, like a pack horse bridge, through the landscape, and it was a really nice. It's kind of a misty day and quite a kind of cloudy day, but occasionally when the sun pushed through, it just had this really, again, quite a kind of pearly looking light, similar to the river image I just shared. And it's just really beautiful out there. I think I'm going to try and get back to the lakes as often as possible. It's a place I've not explored enough, but every time I go I find these kind of landscapes. This is up on that glacier edge that we were driving to in Iceland, and actually this one image has a slight invention to it. All of the images here that I've shown you are single views that are in front of me, but I put them together out of lots of photographs of that single view. This one's a slight bit different in that you can just see that suggestion of the Northern Lights, where you would never see that in daylight because the sunlight would overpower it. This was from a few hours later, from the same day, but I just decided to put them in just to really kind of emphasize that Philip Pullman, his Dark Materials kind of reference. It almost looks like the kind of dust, and it's interesting just seeing a suggestion of it in daylight. But apart from this image, everything else is stuff that was in front of me, things I actually documented, but slightly reworked and slightly made more sort of painterly. But this one has probably got the most amount of invention going on in it. This is inside Odin's Cave, which is in Odin's Gully, which is the area I spoke about earlier in the Hope Valley in the Peak District. And it's this little, I think it's actually, it's not Odin's Cave, it's Odin's Mine. It's actually man-made. It's an old lead mine. And people that walk that way might have been in there. It's kind of an interesting little thing. You see it from the bottom of this strange landslip where a road's kind of crumbled down the hill. And it's just lovely little cave you can have a look inside. And this was on a really snowy day. I'd driven out there from Manchester, and I was almost sheltering in this cave because the snow was falling. So I felt almost like a Neanderthal. I had all wrapped up in a big old beard and stuff. So it was quite funny, kind of sheltering from a big snowstorm in the cave. And this was a photograph I took of that at that moment. This is buttercups in the landscape of Cornwall. I think it's the same field as the buttercup photograph I showed right near the beginning. Only this is the following day. This is overnight. There had been a mist, so because it's in the Lizard Peninsula near St Keverne, so that you get a lot of mist off the sea. So everything was covered in little drips of water, and it's really interesting to sort of compare the two times. The evening shot where you've got that very dry, warm sunset, and the morning everything's damp and dripping with water. This is in the same valley as the Moonlit Cottage in the Brecon Beacons. I'd been trekking in the hills and we're just getting back towards sunset, and I was actually worried we wouldn't get back in time. And this was a farmer's gate, and looking down, lots of sheep were around, kind of ducking out of our way. But it's just a really beautiful day just to be out there. I think this was probably the day after it had snowed, so it was all starting to melt a little bit and starting to take a little bit of shape and a bit slushy, but it was still really beautiful, the whiteness in the landscape. This is back in Iceland. This is a valley of steam in the south of Iceland, where the meltwater from the glaciers was hitting geothermal vents, these kind of hot springs, and it was bubbling and steaming, and there was pools of mud that were kind of bubbling away. It was all quite dramatic and interesting and very beautiful. And I'm used to the landscapes of the United Kingdom where it's it's happened, it's formed, it's been here a long time. It might be eroding, but in Iceland it's still forming. There's still a sense that the volcanic activity is still spewing out land and increasing and reshaping. It felt like a kind of landscape that was alive, and I think this photograph for me captured that sense of it all growing and churning, and geology not being a thing that feels stable, or relatively stable from the point of view of a kind of human lifespan. It felt like, things are changing all the time there. Things are churning and changing, which was fascinating to see. This is a sunset from Cornwall with a very long lens. The sun setting over hills probably about 10 miles away. Just a really sort of beautiful time of day, and you could see, if you watch the sun right as it gets near the horizon, the perfect circle of it gets distorted by the atmosphere, by the different thicknesses of the atmosphere, and sometimes you even see different colours forming, a flash of green as it goes over the horizon. All sorts of strange kind of phenomenon with the visual light spectrum happens as the sun sort of drops out of sight, because it is going through so much atmosphere to get to your eyes there. When it's above you, it's going through a lot less, but here it's going through so much that it just gets distorted and changed in so many ways. And as a photographer, it's really interesting to try and capture that kind of effect. This is up on Derwent Edge in the Peak District. It's a Coach and Horses, or the Coach and Horse rock formation, and I was up there on a really snowy day. Down in the valley there's pretty much no snow at all, but then when I got up on the top, it was falling snow, mist, really dramatic. It felt like I was almost in this white bubble. Beyond, you can see the rocks sort of fading out almost by the ones farthest away there. So maybe if you go about another 10 meters further than that, it was pure white. And I just spent hours photographing it, kind of tramping around in the snow. I think I even had my lunch there, and it was just absolutely amazing. I love it's nice photographing the snow, and I love being out there when it's still snowing. You've got that kind of real cut off of what you can see. You've got the drama of the snow falling. I think if you see this in full res, you can actually see the snow kind of flying through the air, and it's just really good to get out there quickly on those days and capture these places. This is in Northumberland, where there's a dark sky park where you can see the stars really clearly, but you can still see the kind of glow of towns on the horizon, the yellows and the reds. But looking straight above, you could really pick out the stars, and really see the Milky Way and really get a sense of the planets, the colours of the planets, and just really feel connected to the stars because it's so clear and so little light pollution out there. This is a close-up of a moorland stream coming off of Kinder Scout. Really clear, crisp water. Just sometimes you just want to capture something with real clarity, something really sharp and detailed, and that's what I was trying to do here, just capture this kind of clear running water off the tops in real kind of clarity. This is near Tatton Park in the Cheshire countryside. We'd spent a day there, and this was driving home, and I kind of again looked in my rearview mirror and saw this amazing light and mist on a field, so pulled over and got this landscape of the sunset and the mist and the kind of falling daylight and clouds above. Here's one from Snowdonia near the Devil's Kitchen, these big rock formations and lakes, which I explored and I've been back to a few times. And there's nice kind of earthy colours there of the kind of grass and the bracken and the moss on the rocks. It's a really dramatic landscape. I try and get back there whenever I can. This is up near Derwent Reservoir. I'd been photographing Allports Castle, this big landslip. I'd been there all day. Well, I'd been travelling to it most of the day and then caught the sunset there. And then walking home, I decided not to put my head torch on until I had to. So I was walking over the moors and my eyes were adjusting, and it was getting darker and darker. But if you don't put your torch on, or you don't look at your phone, you don't dazzle your eyes, you can see so much for so long. But then as soon as you get to trees and you start getting the shadows of the trees, it gets really hard. So this was pretty much the point where I needed to turn my head torch on and start looking in a bit more detail again with the light. But it was, yeah, just a really beautiful night. It felt really alive out there when you could just see by this faint light of the fading sunlight and a little bit of light from the cities nearby. I think the slight glow on the horizon there is Sheffield. I was heading towards Sheffield at that point, so that's the lights of Sheffield catching the clouds. Here's another photograph from Iceland, the Northern Lights, or the Aurora Borealis, over a fjord near Reykjavik. We'd almost given up on it. We'd stopped a few times looking for the Northern Lights, and we're almost heading back to civilization, and suddenly I looked out the window and I suddenly saw this detail, and it was quite faint, but then by the time I was out there, it was really, really strong, and it was quite a kind of long and thin across the horizon version of the Northern Lights. You see a lot of photographs and it's quite tall, but this really stretched in this kind of ribbon right across the horizon, and it was amazing the way the light from it kind of lit the fjord and clipped the rocks and stones in front of me, and also the way the light of the Northern Lights kind of mingled with starlight, and then clouds were drifting over as well. I've created a whole film of my travels in Iceland, which is on my Journeys Through the Landscape playlist that's on YouTube. So if you want to see more of the Northern Lights, an animated version of this, try and track that down. I'll put a link to it below in the description, so you'll be able to see more of my travels in this beautiful country. We're back in the Brecon Beacons. This is a view of the green valleys, the lush landscape, and I think it was middle of the summer, and it's just so green and beautiful, verdant, I think, out there, full of green, full of life. A lovely place to photograph. This is one photograph from the city, so this is from central Manchester, but looking out towards the hills. Anyone that lives in Manchester will have seen the big television antenna on Winter Hill, which is sort of to the right there of the shot. The sun was setting, and it was just after there'd been a lot of moorland fires, so there was a really kind of heavy, almost syrupy looking sunset because of all the pollution and the smoke in the atmosphere. So you can see that kind of thickness, almost thickness to the atmosphere in this photograph. This is back in Iceland, looking towards the Westmund Isles, some islands off the south coast of Iceland, and just seeing them in the distance, and then how they catch the light, and the light's pushing through the clouds, and this kind of sunlight being reflected in the landscape. Then you just got this really cold blue snow. I like how this this view and this photograph is almost two colours, the kind of creamy warmth of the sky and the sunset, and then this kind of solid cold blue of the snow. This is one from Tatton Park. They've got a Japanese garden there, and this was on a rainy day. It was really pouring it down, but it kind of gave it this lovely shape and character. The rain it made it almost look like a Chinese or Japanese scroll painting, in that a lot of them paintings have a kind of negative space. They let things go to pure white, or they just suggest trees, or they suggest rocks. So this heavy rain allowed me to sort of play with that idea of sort of just suggesting things that are in the distance. This is up on one of the gliders in Snowdonia. I probably pronounced that wrong. These amazing rock formations that are formed by the freeze-thaw fracture, the water, the rainwater getting between the cracks in the rocks, and then at night the rainwater freezing, and as water freezes it pushes apart, it expands, and that pushes the rocks apart, and it creates these cracks, and it creates these really dramatic rock shapes that are hard to believe are formed by nature. You think they're almost man-made, or they look like dragon's teeth, something. They're just hard to believe. So it's a very beautiful place to visit. I'd really recommend getting there if you get the chance. This is a misty morning in the landscape near St Keverne in Cornwall. Just looking down this pathway of the trees and the mist and the light and the dampness in the air. We're back in Northumberland, where it's a dark sky park, and we're looking up through a canopy of trees, but they're winter trees, so we can see straight through, and you can see the kind of outline of the Milky Way directly above, and the shapes of the trees kind of cutting into it, creating pure black space, pure black silhouettes against the Milky Way and the stars above. I like to try and create photographs that frame the landscape, so use rocks or trees to kind of shoot through, so you've almost got a frame within a frame. This is one up on the Roaches where I framed the countryside beyond with the rock formations, so you've got this kind of this view through, and I use that quite a lot. Amongst my tutorials on YouTube, there's a tutorial all about different ideas for how to take photographs, how to set up photographs, and creative ideas for kind of the types of shots to take. I look at things like a frame within a frame, low angles, high angles, close-ups. So I'll put a link to that below as well, and you'll be able to, if you're playing around with photography or just getting into it, you can work your way through I think there's a list of about 12 different ideas for types of photographs, and it's hopefully useful ideas and inspiration when you're out and about. And there's a PDF with that as well, which you can take with you, and it'll hopefully give you inspiration while you're out shooting. We're at Allport Castles now. This is a large landslip. I think it's almost 1 kilometre long in the Peak District. And the one that's the landslip or the rock formation that's central to the shot here is called the Tower. And it's because it looks like a Motte and Bailey castle. But this is all slowly shifting. When you're there, you hear a few rocks kind of tumble in the distance because it is a landslip. Like there's a lot of landslips in the Peak District, but I think this is the biggest one. And it's very dramatic, and it's really beautiful to spend some time there. I was there for sunset, watching the light slowly change and slowly drop below the horizon, and it was a really inspiring place to spend an evening in the summer. We're back in the Peak District. This was on a moonlit walk that I took a couple of summers ago. I was camping and I just couldn't quite get to sleep, so I just went walking for a couple of hours by the moonlight, and again tried to keep my torch turned off so my eyes adjusted. And I was almost heading home, and suddenly I noticed a little bit of shape around the moon. So I got all away from any light and let my eyes adjusted and realised there was this lovely halo. And when I started photographing it and going for longer exposures to pick out the detail, I noticed there was even like a suggestion of a colour to it. There's almost like there was a slight kind of rainbow effect in the halo. So by doing long exposure, I was able to really bring out that colour and detail. This is one from Finland, looking down on a reindeer that was walking beneath me. I was up quite early while I was photographing there on a project for the BBC Philharmonic, and I suddenly started getting followed by a reindeer, and I thought, I don't think this is a good thing. So I got up a little bridge, I looked down, and the reindeer walked directly underneath me, and I just took a very quick photograph on my phone. But it's just this perfect moment, and the drip, I think that line that's kind of towards the top of the shot is a drip from the bridge, but it almost creates like a hill, makes it feel like it's in a landscape with the shadow of the reindeer. We're on the beaches and the sand-covered beaches of Portmeirion here, and the rocks. I love the way the rocks you can see the sort of sedimentary layers, but they're jutting at a really kind of quite a abrupt angle. And this is a place, Portmeirion is a place I go back to a lot. There's a beautiful village, but then there's gardens and trees and all sorts you can explore around there. And then the sands, when the tide's out, the sands go on forever, almost. And it's just a really beautiful place. And even in rainy weather, even in misty weather, there's so much to see and explore there. It's got so much character as a landscape. This one is near Beeston Castle in the Cheshire countryside. It's a lovely day that I went for a walk with my sister, exploring this part of the landscape for the first time, and we just stumbled on this lovely lane, and the light was cutting through. It's quite an early photograph, and perhaps my style's changed a little bit. I think my approach to light is a little bit more subtle, but I still wanted to share some of my earlier work in this. Some of the early ones are maybe a bit too vivid, a bit too punchy, but I think it's good to show where you've come from and how your work's developed over time. This is toadstools and fungi in the Mayhill woodlands in Gloucestershire. I think these are called allergic or something like that. Fungi. I wish I could remember names of things. It's a running theme in this. And there were many other fungi in the woods that day. I think that someone cleared a few branches, so more lights were getting to the woodland floor than they had in a few years. So it was a bumpy year in this one little area, and the colours, the strangeness of them, it was just really wonderful to explore them. And I used a macro lens for this, so that gave me a very low depth of field, so I could kind of play with keeping one thing pin sharp and letting everything else fall out of focus. We're back in Iceland. This is on that same rock formation on the southern coast, looking out after sunset. So the light was drifting, but there was still this slight warm light from the faded sunset clipping the rocks and the snow and the ice. This was on marshlands in Essex, and actually a photograph I took I was walking with my mum. We just had a nice walk together, and because it's marshlands, all you've got is the sky around. You don't see many trees. There's a few trees and a telegraph pole on the left, but it just means it's sort of a celebration of the sky, really. Just this big, beautiful, detailed sky as the sun sets, or almost just after sunset. Everything was being clipped, and it was just a really nice evening to be out walking with my mum. This one's up on Kinder Scout. You've got lots of rock formations on the edge of Kinder Scout, and although I've shown a lot of pictures at sunset and sunrise, I think there is a lot of value to taking pictures in the middle of the day, also taking pictures in not just perfect weather, because for a lot of people, their experience of Kinder Scout will be seeing it in the rain, seeing it in the mist, in the wind, when it's hard going. So this is a photograph of Kinder Scout when it's hard going. I think I only was able to get my camera out for about 25 seconds, quickly photograph it, get it back in the bag because it was raining and misty. You're basically up in the clouds off the Irish Sea, so you just get all the rain dumped on you, and it's pretty damp up there. But I wanted to capture that, but still capture a kind of beauty in the kind of bleakness of it. Here we are back in Cornwall. This is Kynance Cove. Early in the morning, so usually it's full of people, but this is before the people arrived. I think there were a couple of people on there, but just to come clean, I think I might have used Photoshop to get rid of a couple of people, so it looks totally empty, just to kind of take a picture that not many other people have of that empty in daylight. But it was early and empty, and it's a place that means a lot. I've been there with family a lot of times, so it's been really nice to kind of document it and nice and peaceful and calm. This is in Ludds Church in the Peak District, on the edge of the Peak District. It's near the Roaches, and it's this. I think it might be caused by a landslip as well, of some kind, but it's surrounded by trees, so you don't get the sense of the landslip too much. But it's basically this big cut in the land where there's rocks either side and moss and grass, and the sun comes in sometimes, and it's very slippery, very muddy, very damp smelling, but really beautiful. And one of the very lucky things about being a full-time photographer is sometimes I get days off in the week, and often if it's away from school holidays, you can have these places to yourself for hours and just spend time there alone, just really documenting them. And sometimes you just forget about the camera for 5 minutes and just sit there and listen and look. And this was one of those places where I was there for about 3 hours and didn't see another person or didn't hear anyone. Just had time to document it and then have a bit of my own time there and just really take in this beautiful little part of the landscape. We're up on the edge of Snowdonia, rock formations. It's heading down to sea here. You can't really see it because everything's so bright, and looking out towards Anglesey in the distance. And this is in North Wales, and you've just got that slight suggestion of a halo and a sundog in the clouds as well. That slight kind of rainbow effect in the clouds there. And again, we're back almost in the same place. If you the last photograph I showed you, in the distance you would have seen the sea, and in that distance is where I'm stood here in this photograph, and the slight island in the distance is Anglesey, and then the island slightly to the right is, I think it's called Puffin Island, and again that's beneath a sundog, that slight halo in the cloud, that slight mix of colours. I just like the way this one has got quite an unusual feel. It almost, because there's so much reflection going on in the sea, it almost looks metallic. The colours, the greyness, and the reflection makes it almost look like a kind of metal landscape somehow. This is the Brecon Beacons, a phone box. You don't see that many of the red phone boxes left anymore, but this is one in the landscape, just sending out a little bit of light. And someone told me it was left there because there's a lot of army training in the hills, and this is on all the maps as a kind of a way of a wayfinder, I guess. So it was left there when perhaps others had gone, so that it could be used to navigate by. I'm not sure if that's true. It might just be a local tale. But yeah, we were walking out at night in the snow, and it was just amazing to see the fading daylight, but then the warmth of this red telephone box. Up at the top of Snowdon, this was towards the end of the day. I'd almost spent the day walking in slate mines when I decided to get up Snowdon as well. So I was climbing up while everyone else was coming down. So I had the summit almost to myself for about 20 minutes. And then just as I was coming down, the light started pushing through. It was quite cloudy, but I still had some quite good views. And you've got to the right the Snowdon Mountain Railway dropping down the hill, but then lots of the hills of Snowdonia and the lakes and the light cutting through, and then off to different bits of the landscape, the Anglesey in the distance. Just a really beautiful view, and sometimes you see a view that's just full of so much your eyes can barely take it in, so you have to try and capture it in a photograph. This is back in the Cornish countryside, walking on a little old pathway. The light in this image is all from the moonlight. It's really interesting. Once you start working with long exposures, if it's a full moon, then it can almost look like daylight, because all you're getting is, it's basically the moon is acting like a tiny little reflector. Well, not tiny, but from our point of view, tiny. Obviously, it's big, but it's acting like a reflector, and all it's reflecting is sunlight, and that sunlight has all the possibility of creating the same colours we see in daylight, but it's so faint that our eyes don't pick it up. We just see it as a kind of blue light, because we don't see colour very well when light is very slight. But with a camera and with long exposures, 30-second exposures, and really pushing the sensitivity of the camera and opening the aperture wide, you can really soak up that moonlight, and it can look just like daylight, and suddenly you see all these colours, these pinks, greens, yellows are actually still in the landscape. There's a video I've put on my tutorial channel that tells you all about exposure control, aperture control, things like that, which will hopefully give you a little bit of guidance if you want to try these ideas out yourself. And at some point I will be creating a night photography tutorial as well, which will talk you through working with very long exposures at night. So keep an eye open for that. This photograph was taken on a fjord in Norway when we were sailing down it a couple of years ago. Just at sunset. It had been quite a cloudy day, but then the light just sort of pushed through right at the end of the day, and just, yeah, really captured the landscape beautifully. This photograph of a lake and a little boat was photographed in Queensland in Australia, a place called Possum Valley, where we stayed for the night, and we had the place to ourselves. And not long before, someone had spotted a kangaroo in a tree. It was, yeah, and it was really hot, so it was lovely just to get to this cooling lake and have a little drift around on the boat. We were just doing this road trip in the outback, and it was just lovely to be there, but then to photograph it. And in this image I really want to kind of capture the redness of the soil. Everything seemed to have this redness to it, so I really kind of captured that, and because the sun was dropping, it kind of had that glow to it all as well. This is a icicle in Troller's Gill in the Yorkshire Dales, and it's just catching the morning sun, so I guess that would accelerate its melting. So I stood there for a while just photographing away, and eventually managed to capture a drip as it fell, and it just created this interesting light, and it caught the sunlight as it was falling on this lovely winter's morning a few months ago. We're back here in Northumberland, a shot of the stars through the trees again. But this one is a bit different because it's got the light of nearby farms and towns, so it's this interesting mix going from greens and reds and blues of the stars. It's like a little a little kind of spectrum of colours against the black outline of the trees. This is on Ramshaw Rocks, which is near the Roaches, where you've got this kind of ridge of gritstone rocks, again creating these really sort of dramatic shapes, these almost spikes, all leaning in the same direction, all kind of pointing up. But then you've got the towns beyond. I think Leek might be one of the towns that you can see in the distance there. So you've got this kind of really kind of brutal nature and geology and interesting rock formations framed against the towns and the roads. That there's a straight road going off in the distance, which I think is an old Roman road, so it's perfectly straight going through the landscape there. This photograph's from a olive grove in Corfu. I went on a trip with friends quite a few years ago now, and we hired mopeds and just kind of got lost, went to see lots of different parts of the island, and eventually somehow found ourselves down this little path, and suddenly we saw this beautiful view of these olive groves and this sunlight pushing through, and you've got that lovely kind of Mediterranean light and that colour as well, that kind of dryness of the grass. Just had a really nice atmosphere to the view. This is from the top of the Rhinos Pass in the Lake District, which is a pass that cuts between two large valleys, and it's quite a dramatic road to drive, very sharp turns, very steep. But when you get to the top, you get great views in both directions. This was a moment when the sun just broke through the clouds. It was quite a rainy day, but there's just a bit of light at one point, just kind of hitting the landscape. Here's one from the Peak District early in the morning when the sun was still low in the sky and I was quite low in the ground. I think there was a bump in the field, so suddenly I could really see through this dry stone wall. You could really see all the gaps in it and the fact that it has been kind of put together by the leaning stones. There's nothing to fill it. They're all kind of rested there. So I quite like this look. It almost looks like dominoes have fallen or something like that. It's quite haphazard, and seeing the light through it and the sunlight the other side really kind of emphasizes that. This is from a day's walking in the snow in the Brecon Beacons. I was the first one out there. There was hardly any other footprints, just a few animals. I think I even saw a fox a bit earlier. There are some footprints in that one, but this is that they're my footprints because I just walked through and I turned around and looked back at this view, and it was just a really beautiful morning. The trees were weighed down with snow, and it almost was like a cave. I was amongst this kind of planted forest and looking out towards the sun and the light, but being right contained amongst all the heavy trees that no light was getting through. This one is of the Staffordshire landscape near to Fors Cave. I can't remember quite the name of the village it's near, but I was there photographing all day, getting into the cave and walking down the Manifold Valley. But then on driving home, suddenly there's this amazing sunset, and it really contrasted with the white of the fields. You've got this total warmth and redness of the sky, and then almost the blue, cold greyness of the fields below. This is one from Odin's Gully in the Peak District, and Odin's Mine is actually in this photograph. Again, this felt almost like a Japanese or Chinese scroll painting. The kind of negative space, the pure white that this sits amongst, and the absence of colour, but it is a full colour photograph, but the colour is so set back against the white that you can barely see it. But if you look really closely, you can see kind of reds of and oranges of dead bracken and slight greens of the moss on the cliffs and the rocks. But yeah, it's a really beautiful spot I go back to a lot, but it was really interesting seeing it in the snow. It almost looked like lacy. You've got all this detail and white and black cutting through as the snow was falling. Here we are looking down the Snowdon Mountain Railway and heading down into the valleys, and I just really like using that the lines of the railway track almost as a framing device and almost as a way of leading your eyes down into the valley, so you can see the track heading down the hills in front into the distance, so it kind of draws you in and creates quite a sort of dramatic sense of depth. And by having that railway line really as the main focus right in the foreground and filling so much of the shot, it really just takes your eyes on a journey almost through the landscape. This is from the Hope Valley in the Peak District, a little hillside stream. I was actually stood in the water here with my wellies on, and it was the sun was just coming down and picking out the trees, picking out the roots, the moss, and just really creating this nice sort of dramatic little scene. The sun was even clipping the ferns above me, so there was so much detail, and it was so early in the morning. I think we arrived there and it was dark, so it's just really lovely to see the sun arrive and try and get to the best place, and then the sun kind of aligned with this little stream, that I was standing in, and then you see the trees above and the landscape around. It was a really nice morning to be out there exploring the Peak District. Here we are in Tuscany in Italy, an abbey, Abbey of San Antonio, I think. I'm so bad at remembering names. I really apologise. Like I say, I'll put some names of places I'm not 100% sure on in the narrative. I'll put little notes below in the description so you can see where these places are. But yeah, this was a place we spent some time exploring the vineyard and the abbey. And this is actually built out of many photographs from quite a few different positions. So it was almost like a painting. I used a wide angle lens for the vineyard and the grapes in the foreground, and then a longer lens for the abbey in the distance. And I think the clouds came from a different time of day. So this was really like this idea of how maybe a landscape painter would go to a landscape and create lots of studies, document bits of it, the clouds moving, light in different places, spend a few hours there, and then back at their studio, bring all those studies together to create their kind of perfect version of this view. And I do that with my photographs sometimes. So through lots of little photographic studies, different lenses, different positions, I then bring those together in my studio to create this kind of almost painterly view where I can sort of control the features. I can have the benefit of the wide angle lens, so you feel like you stood next to the grapes, but then also have the longer lens of the abbey in the distance, so you feel like that's closer, you feel like that's nearer and more detailed. We're walking here in the Peak District between Hathersage and Grindleford on a very snowy morning, and this one is really about light. I love seeing effects of light I've never seen before. So this was fairly early in the morning. The sun was hitting the snow and it was creating this little low icy mist, and that was going down onto the river. I think it's the River Derwent there, and you've got the light of the sun coming through the trees, but then that is then bouncing off the water, and you've just got beams of light going in all sorts of directions, and also the light's clipping the snow, so it's creating quite a dramatic kind of texture, and it's really kind of contouring the landscape. I really like shooting into the sun. If you shoot into the sun, everything is so detailed and contoured, it works really well. Here we are from a flight over Iceland, looking at the snow-covered landscape. Again, we've got valleys of mist filling the valleys, and like low clouds, and we'd flown from Reykjavik in the morning when it was dark, and we saw the sunrise happen as we were flying, and it was just so beautiful seeing it skim across this and seeing the shadows of the mountains, and it was just an otherworldly experience. Sometimes you see things and you just can't quite believe they're real, and this was one of those mornings that I'll never forget. Here we are in the Peak District looking at the Hope Valley from Odin's Gully, which I keep talking about. It's at the base of Mount Tor. This is a photograph very early in the morning when we got there. I watched the sunrise. I was filming it as well, but I've got this photograph. And there's a cement works in the valley, and it's kind of ugly. You've got this beautiful valley, and then this one bit of industry, but it is a kind of iconic for that bit of the landscape. If you know it, you kind of get your bearings by it. And if you see in the distance, the smoke from the chimney is just where the sun is, so it happened to cut a little bit of the power and the strength out of the sun, so it just creates a really nice kind of exposure that sits really kind of well across everything. The sun's not really bright, it kind of cuts a bit of the brightness out of the sun, so you've got detail everywhere, and from the bracken in the foreground that's just catching the morning light, and the kind of autumn leaves on the trees, right through to the valley and the mist of Castleton and Hope in the distance. It was just, yeah, a real privilege to be out there and see that morning. It was a special one, seeing the mist out there and the valley. This is sailing close to the English coast. This is a wind farm that's off the Essex or Suffolk coast, and we sailed past it late in the day, and there was, just as we were getting near it, a big rainstorm and thunderstorm arrived, and it was just really black and grey and lightning. But then I think the sun just got a little bit lower in the sky, so it was beneath the heaviest of the clouds. So it was raining, and there was still lightning, but because the sun had gone beneath the really heavy clouds, it was a sunset as well. So it was the most unusual mix of light and weather I think I've ever seen. It was raining, sunlight, rich, warm colours. It was just such a vivid mix. And then obviously you've suddenly got the form and the shape of the windmills moving, and it was like nothing I've ever seen before. So I think I took about 1,000 photographs of this. Sometimes you find yourself somewhere so unique and so one-off that you know you're never going to get back, and even if you did, you probably wouldn't see anything like this. So I just kept shooting and eventually got a photograph that had this kind of mystery and depth and redness, which came out really well. And this one's from the same balloon flight as the detail I showed right at the beginning of this slideshow, of the hills and the valleys and the mist. This is a much wider shot where you can really see the contours and textures of the landscape. I think details you might not see when you're down there, but there's like the grooves of the old-fashioned farming and the shape of old where buildings used to be, things you wouldn't quite see when you were there, but the low sun and the high angle of the photograph really start picking out these details of the White Peak in the Peak District. And you can also see, if you look really carefully around the sun, there's a halo there, and you can just about see a sort of spectrum of light in the halo. It's very subtle, and I don't think I noticed it while I was taking the photograph, but when I was back in my studio and I played with the exposure a bit, made them a tiny bit darker, I was able to see that outline of the halo that was faintly there. This is a tree in the Peak District from a walk with my family, and it just really caught my eye. The light, the sun, the way it lent into the shot, the way the beams of light kind of cut on the grass in front of it. It just kind of felt like an abundance of life, kind of brimming, the greenness of the trees, the branches curving and twisting and pushing towards the light. It was just a real kind of joyous moment of nature, which I was really happy to have been able to catch. Here we are, another one from the Peak District, the snow-covered hillside wood of near Odin's Gully. You've got these lovely trees, and you can see where the snow's kind of been caked to the trees because of the wind. It's almost a black and white photograph, but this is full color. But it's such a landscape drained as color that there isn't, there's nothing to see. But it's it's just a really beautiful morning to kind of see these details of the trees and these kind of skeletal forms, almost like arms reaching out. Here's a stream that runs down into Oldswater. I was camping a bit further upstream from here with friends, and we just stopped, and I think the mossiness of the rock really caught my eye. You see that so much in the Lake District, these kind of moss-covered rocks and such a green landscape there. It rains a lot, so everything is so green and growing and verdant, and the streams are just full of life and full of kind of churning water. And I managed to get there just as the sun was setting, so everything was nice and defined and had these lovely sort of details to the landscape and the close-up. I guess the close-up landscape, I like photographs where you've got a distant view of the hills and mountains, but then you suddenly see similar forms repeated in the things right in front of you, the things you stood on, the rocks, the grass, the kind of curves in the moss. Here's one from Thailand landing in Phuket, coming down, just photographing it from a plane window, but this was the first time I'd ever seen this kind of landscape, the kind of islands you get out there popping out of the water. So it was really nice to sort of capture that and get my camera on the window, take loads of pictures as the plane was landing and banking a little bit. So the banking of the plane allowed me to kind of get different angles, get a bit of the sky, get a bit of the islands behind us, and kind of cram them into this photograph. Here we are at a place that's very famous within landscape art. This is Flatford Mill, Willie Lott's cottage, Constable country in Suffolk, where he did a lot of his paintings. I think this is Willie Lott's cottage, and it appears in a lot of his paintings. And I tried to give this photograph a kind of treatment of his paintings. I tried to capture detail in a similar way to how he does. The amount of detail he has in the sky, John Constable's has in his sky. The kind of, he has very dark foliage, so I allowed the foliage to go very deep and dark as I put this image together. So I was trying to create a realistic photograph, but capturing detail as he captured it as well, as John Constable caught it. Here's a wind farm from Overdon Mill near Halifax. Very, very cold. I think it was Boxing Day, quite a few years ago. But it was, really beautiful sunset, and the sun was just capturing the frost-covered moorland, the bracken and the heather on the moorland, and the wind farm. This was again, we're going back to my really early landscape photographs here, and these photographs had quite fluid forms. As I built them, they became quite distorted, and I sort of like that, and I work with it. And I don't do it as much now, but I still quite like it. But I think my images have calmed down a little bit since these early ones. But I quite like playing with the twisted horizon, creating images that had almost a fluid feel to them. And this all comes from putting many images together. As you put them together, they take on unusual shapes, and you can either try and correct them, or you can try and sort of make them a feature of the shot. So those unusual shapes of the composite photograph are kind of what causes that line and that shape of the horizon, and then I work into that and build it and emphasize it. This is looking back at Snowdonia, the late afternoon light clipping across the hills, going through the atmosphere, the slight fog in the air, and just defining the landscape. And it's almost a totally devoid of any man-made objects, but if you look in the foreground, there's a pipe from a reservoir or a lake up in the hills that's coming down from the top. So I quite like just having that one little bit of everything's on such a scale and so kind of formidable and formed by nature, but there's one detail that's man-made, kind of dwarfed by this landscape. Here's one looking back at Manchester from late 2019. Everything I've shown so far has been nearly everything I've shown so far has been very focused on the natural landscape. But this one is a city I live in, but it's a city that is surrounded by the hills. A lot of the photograph I've shown you is in the Peak District or the Cheshire countryside, or kind of heading towards the Pennines. So it's surrounded by the landscape, and we're so lucky that probably like 60%, maybe more of the photographs I've shown you are within an hour and a half, 2 hours drive of Manchester. And you can see the hills in the background. We're surrounded, there's like a C shape of hills around the city. So we're so lucky to have all this nature around us in the city. And this photograph sort of captures that. You can see the hills and the landscape beyond, and the hills and the landscape in front as well. This is from over near Bury, photographed in the hills over that way. And the final image, I thought we'd end on a sunset. We'll go into the sunset. This is a sunset at sea. Again, that idea of waiting for an hour after the sunset, there's still light, and sometimes that can be the most interesting and dramatic light, as it kind of is over the horizon, just clipping some clouds in the distance. So I hope you've enjoyed the slideshow. If you've watched the whole thing and stuck with it all, that's incredible. If you've just ducked into it and had a few little clips here and there, then I hope you've enjoyed that as well. I'm not going to do a big sell, but all of these prints are available. All of these photographs are available as prints. A lot of them are in my print shop on Andrew Brooks Artists website, but some of them aren't. But if there's any that catch your eye and you like, then please let me know, as I can probably make them available as well. Also, I've set up a buy me a coffee thing, which allows you to, if you've enjoyed my creative output, just to send a couple of quid my way as a kind of to support my work, support me making more of these videos, sharing more stuff, and then eventually getting out and there and creating more photography. So it's been a big help. Like I mentioned, we're in lockdown at the moment, so it's been a big help in supporting me through that and allowing me to create these videos and share ideas and kind of get stuff on YouTube. So thank you for everyone that's chipped into that so far. Yeah, and I really hope you've enjoyed it. If anyone's got any questions or subjects they'd like me to cover connected to photography or video or Photoshop, then let me know. And thanks again for watching.